Hi, welcome to my presentation on the intent, implementation, and impact of a unit of nurses who changed medicine in history. In this presentation, I'll be covering why we teach history and why it's such a vital part of the primary curriculum. I'll then move on to the intent, implementation, and impact of the unit, including why I chose the topic, what makes a good history lesson, and the three critical decisions around my implementation. Finally, I'll be looking at the evaluation and how this is going to guide my future practice. So why teach history? Well, it connects the past to the present, and by learning about other cultures, it can develop empathy and understanding of others. Pupils can consider how the past influences the present, what past societies were like, and what beliefs and cultures influence people's actions. As they do this, pupils will develop a chronological framework for their knowledge of significant events and people. They'll see the diversity of human experience and understand more about themselves as individuals, and what they can learn can influence their decisions about personal choices, attitudes, and values. Secondly, it promotes critical thinking. History is not just memorizing dates. It encourages questions. Why did this happen? What would have happened if? And how did this occur? Furthermore, it's essential to look at different sides of the story, questioning the validity and reliability of sources. In history, pupils find evidence, weigh it up, and reach their own conclusions. And to do this, they need to be able to research and critically analyze evidence, arguing their point of view. And these are skills that are prized in adult life. Finally, inspiration. History fires pupils' curiosity about the past, has the capacity to excite and engage children through its wide variety of incredible stories. And this is key as we as teachers aim to inspire a passion for learning and ultimately a desire to find out more independently. When deciding which topic to choose, I looked at the national curriculum for Key Stage 1 and decided to focus on the lives of significant individuals, namely Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. Also, I was aware of the key skills that pupils were aiming to learn, and this informed my choices and my three critical decisions, namely on the chronological framework, asking and answering questions, and choosing and using from stories and other sources to show understanding. So what makes a good history lesson? The pedagogy behind what makes a good history lesson involves three interlinked elements, which are substantive knowledge, disciplinary concepts, and historical inquiry. Substantive knowledge refers to the specific facts, events, and concepts that pupils learn about the past. It's the core content of historical study, encompassing what happened, where, when, and why, as well as the important figures and ideas associated with specific periods. Disciplinary concepts refer to deeper understanding of how historians study and interpret the past. They're not specific historical facts, but rather the skills and perspectives employed when examining the past, for example, cause and consequence. Finally, historical inquiry is about asking questions and hypothesizing about the past that we hope the evidence will help us to answer. Byron argues that only when all these aspects of history are carefully and thoroughly mixed in the appropriate balance is the subject discipline really being developed. Thus, when it came to my medium-term planning and choosing my three critical decisions, I endeavoured to have these core strands running throughout all my sequence of lessons. Considering the implementation of my lessons, I made three critical decisions which shaped the planning process and were a common thread throughout the unit. These were chronology, historical inquiry and interpretation, and historical understanding and concepts, and I'll now go on to discuss each of those decisions and the theory I used behind them. Chronology is a key area of history, as Hodgkinson suggests that without a comprehensive grasp of historical time, children will fail to understand how to sequence events, periods, and people chronologically. Duhl goes on to suggest that the goal is to provide children with the tools to build this usable framework of the past, wherein they can navigate themselves, making linkages across past, present, and even potentially future time. So given that the concept of chronological understanding needs to be specifically developed, it is important to build the use of time vocabulary into taught sessions. It's also important to make reference and use of timelines, and therefore I aim to incorporate and develop these throughout my sequence of lessons. I strive to include timelines that were actively referred to, reinforced, and added to in order to build children's experience and knowledge. The main theory that influenced my approach was Rosenshine's principles of instruction, focusing on sequencing concepts and modeling, so presenting new material in small steps, providing models, and providing scaffolding for difficult tasks. So with the example of timelines, I wanted to start with familiar concepts, for example, putting the events of the school day, and then building upon that to maybe what happened in their lifetime before moving on to the historical context. I also used lots of visual aids such as pictures and symbols and even timeline templates to help scaffold the children, as well as sentence starters and structured language. It's also vital to model the process and to also think aloud while doing so that children can understand the thought process behind building up a chronological timeline. Looking at historical inquiry and interpretation, the 2023 Ofsted report found that teachers in many schools focused on pupils forming their own interpretations about the past without teaching them how historians and others do this. Therefore, in order to combat this, I wanted to ensure that pupils built their inquiry skills through prompted class discussions and were probed to explain and argue their points using evidence. By the end of the unit, I hope that children would be able to recognize sources need to be questioned and that history is made up of several points of view. Mastery learning is more than just the recall of facts, it's the acquisition of the principles of the skills and knowledge. And progressing through Bloom's taxonomy means moving from basic to more complex levels of thinking, with each step building on the previous one, encouraging deeper learning and critical thinking as students advance. Here I wanted to use it to progress through my series of lessons and really build upon that historical inquiry as we moved up throughout Bloom's taxonomy in the unit. Finally, for historical understanding and concepts, it was important to move beyond just the core knowledge and really include the background information that makes it meaningful and placing it in context. It was vitally important that children understood the context so that they could see the big picture. For example, when teaching about Mary Seacole, I wanted to build in enough time to learn about racial prejudice and make sure children really understood the impact of that at the time. Task model relates closely to understanding and developing concepts by guiding learners through a structured, reflective thinking process. It helps pupils to make sense of what they're learning by encouraging them to actively engage, question, and apply knowledge in meaningful ways. We could start by building from learning facts about Florence Nightingale and why she's important, and then building on understanding by recognizing the problems she identified, the unsanitary conditions. Finally, we'd move on to the deeper understanding of how she actually improved them, and explaining reinforces knowledge and encourages discussion. When it came to assessing the impact of my unit, Jewell, Russell and Hales state that historical understanding is by its nature complicated and difficult to assess, since it relates to the development of conceptual understanding within the context of substantive knowledge, as well as the ability to deploy the skills. Therefore, formative assessment in all its many forms is key, as it provides breadth and depth of historical understanding. In recognizing the importance of formative assessment, Russell declares that any form of assessment is only ever a snapshot of a particular moment of time, and that multiple pieces of evidence are needed to make effective judgments. Therefore, in my series of lessons, I aim to assess children through varied approaches. For example, listening to discussions, using targeted and formative questions, as well as checking their independent written work. The only way to assess efficiently is to incorporate it into planning, and I chose specific activities to produce the results I wanted when I wanted, and activities that were linked to challenging their inquiry-based learning. I wanted to end by talking about self-development and how this is going to guide my future practice. It's patently clear that no teacher can have a comprehensive knowledge of every period of history, and it's recommended for practitioners to complete their own timeline of the national curriculum content to help them see the narrative and identify any gaps. I aim to do that and develop my own understanding, build confidence, and widen my knowledge. Hodgkinson also states that timelines should not be confined to the introductory lessons, and they should be employed with every lesson and utilised in a lively and interactive manner, which I hope to build into my future planning. Finally, it's vital to anticipate any misconceptions that the children might have. In this way, they can appropriately be addressed when they appear in the lessons. Really enjoyed preparing this presentation and this medium-term plan, and I hope to one day be able to enact it in a classroom myself. Thank you for listening.